Thank you. It's a bit of an old bio, but no longer acting, been in the role now for quite some time, but I'll explain a bit of that. So I work for the Australian Honeybee Industry Council. I'll tell you a bit about that in a sec, but I want to reflect on my biggest takeaway from this conference over the last 2 days. It's been an amazing couple of days, great conference, but the foresight of your industry to bring all the berries together as one, under the one collective, has been so powerful, and just something I've really observed over the last couple of days, the impact that has and the power it creates. And it's evident just by the calibre of people at this conference over the last couple of days. So whoever came up with that foresight of bringing all the berries together like that, should be commended. It's amazing. So as I said, I work for the Australian Honeybee Industry Council. What I'm going to talk to you today about is my experiences in the Varroa incursion in New South Wales that happened in 2022 and is still continuing, and my experiences and learnings that I've taken away from that, from both a biosecurity perspective, but things the industry can do to be a bit better prepared and perhaps learn from our mistakes and observations going through. But to put into perspective just what we do as a peak industry body for the honeybee industry, we are a very small peak industry body. In fact, we just have traditionally one employee, being me, for the last 3 or 4 years. And I can actually proudly say that despite Varroa being devastating for the industry, we've actually resulted in doubling the size of ARBIC by having an additional employee to help us with the workload that's been occurring. But we're governed by a volunteer board of beekeepers, pretty typical of small peak industry bodies for the industry. And we are a federated model, so I have 10 member bodies who are all associations in their own right, with their own executives and their own membership base. So you can just imagine having all those people around the table and trying to get any sort of clarity around decisions in a time of crisis, what that might look like. Those represented member bodies are all from across the supply chain. So recreational beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, honey packers. However, I'm going to talk specifically about the New South Wales Varroa experience, but it's not been our first rodeo. We have had a number of detections and incursions over the years, but nothing to the size of the Varroa incursion that we've experienced over the last 3 years. In case, and I suppose just to validate why I can speak to you guys about this, I was in the IMT, the Incident Management Team, on day 2 of the incursion in June 2022. I spent the first 3 or 4 months living in Orange at the State Control Centre, and I can tell you Orange is a very cold place, and immersed in this response 7 days a week for quite some time. Still involved in it on a daily basis, so we're nearly 2.5, 3 years in, and still heavily involved. I have done some training prior to, in preparation for a response, including industry liaison training, some media training, etc. But it made it really interesting in the size of this response with the amount of industry liaison officers involved. So I was lucky enough to work not only with 3 or 2 other honeybee industry liaison officers, but a number of pollination dependent industry liaison officers, Rachel being one of those, and almonds and apples as well. So we were able to work together as a team and try and get some sort of result for industry through the response. And during the later part of the response, we have done debrief on debrief on debrief on debrief, but I'm very fearful that those debriefs are being documented and shelved, never to be seen again or learned from. So I'm always keen to get up and talk about some of those learnings, specifically to industry, so we can try and make sure that we try and do a better job of some of these responses moving forward. I often get asked this question at the end of the presentation, so I'll address it up front. Why are we playing in the plant space? We're a livestock industry, essentially, an insect industry. 10 years ago, we used to be part of the animal industry. My leaders, the forefathers, sat in the animal space in the room and had a look around and goes, ooh, if something goes wrong here, we haven't got a lot of friends in this space. So they hopped across to Plant Health Australia and sat in the room and had a look around and go, you know what, there's a lot of plant industries that depend on us as an industry to survive. So we ended up thinking we had a lot more friends in that space if something went really wrong in terms of sharing the cost. And luckily, that's what happened in this response. In case you have been under a rock and weren't aware of the Varroa response that's been going on for the last 3 years, there was a detection in some sentinel hives at the Port of Newcastle in June 2022. It was found in those sentinel hives at the port, and very quickly the New South Wales biosecurity staff found it at much higher levels, some distance away from the port, indicating it wasn't the first detection at the port. That resulted in what ended up being the largest plant pest response in Australia's history, working across New South Wales. Now, the largest plant pest response costs a lot of money. It's an upper limit or a budget of $100 million cost shared across the affected parties. And in addition to that, New South Wales government has also spent another $50 million in this response. The really sad part of the response we're trying to eradicate is the impact it's had on beekeepers' livelihoods, their businesses, their families. In trying to eradicate varroa, the only way you can get rid of it is remove the host being honeybees. So in the process of the bit over a year eradication attempt, we destroyed 47,000 honeybee colonies, which is a case of pouring petrol on them and wrapping them up and then deep burying them. So that had a huge impact on our industry. It wasn't until September 2023 that the consultative committee, the technical committee advisory in response, decided that it was no longer technically feasible to eradicate, and that we would move to a transition and management process. Now, this all operates under the Emergency Plant Pest Deed, which we're signatories to through Plant Health Australia. The deed dictates who's involved and who are cost-shareable partners, and in this response we had 26 different cost-sharing partners. They were 15 or 16 pollination-dependent industries, plant industries, and all levels of government. And everyone had a single vote. Didn't matter how much you contribute, how big your industry was, or how big the government department was, it's a single vote. And most of the decisions have to be unanimous. So the impacts, I also get asked quite a lot about why did we persist for so long, spend so much money on trying to eradicate a pest which was arguably a really tall order. There was always a chance of eradication, but the odds were never really in our favour. But why did we persist in it? We know that Australia has been the last major honey producing country in the world to be free of varroa mite. That means we were able to look at other countries to see what their experiences have been with varroa mite and how they're managing it and what the impacts of an eradication program might look like. We know that varroa mite, it really does damage to bees. On its own, it can kill a colony if it's left unmanaged, but where it really hurts bees is the viruses it vectors. So it can transmit viruses, particularly a virus called deformed wing virus, and that's where it really decimates colonies. So when we look at the impacts globally about what's happened to industries where the incursions have occurred, it's required a significant change in management practices from the beekeepers. Beekeeping, like most ag industries, are an ageing industry towards the end of their careers, and we're asking them to make some significant changes, like putting chemicals in hives. Our beekeepers never had to use chemicals, and now we're saying, you know what, you've got to read an SDS, you've got to understand how to read a label, rotate chemicals, and they're all going, some of them are going to say, too hard, I'm getting out. So we're expecting to see a significant reduction in the size of the industry. A lot of people exit. We'll see a consolidation, a restructure. We might see some of the younger generation get bigger. We might see in time what we saw in other countries, opportunities emerge, people re-enter the industry as things like pollination sort of become a bigger draw card. We know that's going to significantly increase the cost of production. 30% is pretty conservative, but it's going to be significantly a significant impost on the beekeepers. Importantly for this audience with berries, maybe not so much under protected cropping scenarios, but open for sure, we know from every other country in the world that's had varroa mite that 90 to 95% of the feral bees, they're the unmanaged European honeybees in the environment that live in your shed walls and your roofs and the trees, will die. Left unmanaged, varroa kills hives. There's just no two ways about it. So there's going to be a significant change in the agricultural landscape coming over the next decade. We also know that this mite, even when managed, still kills hives. New Zealand has been managing varroa now for over 20 years. They've been averaging somewhere between 15 and 20% colony losses over winter. So 15 and 20% of their business disappears over winter. The USA have been managing it for over 50 years, they've just experienced their biggest colony loss after over 50 years of management at 62% colony losses from their commercial beekeepers. All the beekeepers are attributing the losses mainly to varroa. So quite significant changes coming our way. I've heard quite a few times from different plant industries saying, oh, well, that was last year's news, you guys are over it now, you're managing it and moving forward, aren't you? This is just showing, it's a bit poor on this screen, but the colours are showing where the current infestations are. So one outcome, positive outcome of the eradication attempt is we have slowed the spread. We've bought time for our beekeepers to get educated, we've been able to get chemicals registered, practices in place, and contained it largely to the coastal areas. But you can see quite a lot of spots through New South Wales. So we know that it is at low levels right across New South Wales. In fact, it has moved into Victoria, northwestern Victoria, a couple of detections there, and just yesterday, a new one in the middle of Victoria. So it is moving, but moving slowly. So we're effectively slowing the spread. Buying time for our beekeepers to get ready, but also buying time for us to help raise awareness amongst our pollination-dependent industries of what might be coming and getting them prepared. Okay, so key lessons from a biosecurity perspective. The deed, which is probably the most boring document you'll ever read in your life, is an effective tool. It does get bashed around a lot by the people who are signatories to it, but it is the rule book on how we run responses in the plant industry. Really effective way of determining cost sharing, causes a lot of arguments and discussion, but it is the envy of a lot of other countries around the world. So I've spoken to the US, Indonesia, New Zealand about how the deed has worked in the response, and they are all looking at about how they can improve their system by adopting something similar. Changing from Animal Health to Plant Health Australia, having those independent organisations, so they're non-government, non-industry, as the umpire is great. They provide and enforce the rule book, being the deed, they're the custodians of the deed, and that has worked fabulously for a lot of us in the response, being able to go to them as the independent umpire. The capabilities came in New South Wales, who has a huge department in ag space. Coming into New South Wales and the capability of the department to respond quickly worked really well. And the IMT, or the incident management team, and their willingness to accept industry at the table and advice from industry and actually listen was really good. I've worked in many responses since being in this role, and I can tell you not all governments want to listen to industry or even take advice to industry. So in New South Wales, they were fabulous at that. What didn't work so well with the biosecurity system that we've got, that first person that puts their hand up to say, I found the pest, time and time again, was absolutely bashed over the head by industry, saying, you've done something wrong, you've broken the rules. No, they just found a pest, they were honest. Too many times we saw, after those first people were detected and bashed over the heads, made other beekeepers super reluctant to put their hand up first. So what we were finding is some poor bugger would put their hand up and say, I found it. DPI would go out and do the surveillance, and all of a sudden it would pop up all the way around them really quickly in a week. It had been there for quite some time. And so that system of penalising those first responders isn't working. We need to flip that and reward the people that put their hand up first. The whole question around the impacts we have, I talked about destroying those colonies. At the moment, the way they're making the decisions is really based on biosecurity risk minimisation first, and then let's see how we can make business operate in that. We need to flip that around and say this is how business operates. At what point in that operation can we minimise biosecurity risks and still enable business continuity, rather than stopping business, applying biosecurity risk mitigation, and then seeing how we can make business work. Social licence is huge. It's something that I see written to a lot of these plans as triggers, but how do you measure it? How do you fix it? How do you know when it's going bad? Social media has just absolutely changed the landscape with social licence, and when it starts going south, it goes south really quickly, and we saw that in the varroa response. Recovery is another thing that doesn't work. In all the strategies I've read, they talk about responding early, eradication, management, and then recovery. The recovery piece is missing. So for me, recovery is about helping those businesses that we've impacted the most by biosecurity response get back up on their feet and operating again. We just don't do that. And we'll see that in many responses throughout the time I've been working in here. We need to understand the decision-making process in these responses and really think about how do we inject business continuity into it, like I just said before, and then think about how biosecurity risk mitigation can fit into it. There's room, I think, for a whole of system review. At the moment, the system rewards departments from not having a huge amount of biosecurity staff on hand because of the cost sharing abilities. So they run a skeleton team as soon as there's a response, bring in all the staff because then they're cost shareable. So we need to look at that, and we need to talk about this recovery piece. From an industry perspective, what are some of the things we're seeing? So it's about, oh, my photos are gone. It's about having industry capacity and leadership. So in peacetime, before these responses, we need to get ourselves organised as industries, understand that we've got enough capacity within our peak industry bodies to be able to respond to these things and work in these responses, understand the communication channels and have them well established and working before a response, not like us where we try to develop those communications during the response, and understand the decision-making process from an industry perspective beforehand as well. So I know in the berry industry you've got multiple industry bodies who are all going to want to have a say in a response. You need to have absolute clarity about how that process works now before a response. And we heard Greg talking about jurisdictions and border restrictions. My experience in this response is jurisdictions act as sovereign countries and make their own rules up as they see fit. And so there's a real need to understand the risk that has to your industry and have some risk mitigation in beforehand and have those conversations. That bottom piece about industry emotions for the honeybee industry was huge. We were having businesses destroyed and a lot of decisions were being made based on emotion rather than fact. So understanding that and briefing industry about how to make decisions based on facts, not emotions, was really important. And being prepared early. So clearly defining the roles within the industry, doing some understanding when you've got these multiple associations, both at a state level and a federal level, who's going to make the decision, how that's going to work, particularly around who's your spokesperson. There's nothing more confusing for industry when you've got multiple people peddling multiple different messages that are not consistent. You need some approved spokespeople that are working to speakers' notes to be able to get consistent messaging out there. Understand that decision-making process. Industry training, so having enough industry liaison officers available and trained, and not training the people at the end of the career who won't be here in 10 years' time. It's making sure you've got the right people that are young enough who are going to be around in industry that have the time to be able to put into these responses. And making sure those industry liaison or your spokespeople have media training to understand that, because the media come at these responses like a whirlwind. And if you're not trained on how to deal with them, you can come unstuck really, really quickly. Documentation. When I came into the Varroa response, the incident controller in New South Wales told me a story about a response he did a few months prior to that, which was in the red meat industry. And he said he came into his desk and on his desk was a pile of papers. He already had legal orders drafted, he already had budgets drafted, he already had communications to the consultative committee drafted. And he said it just made it so much easier that they could just focus on the response rather than focusing on the documentation. We didn't have that as a honeybee industry, so we came in there, all of a sudden had to put together a legal team and start drafting emergency orders, start putting all this work into documentation rather than just getting on and getting the job done. So having all that prepared, and how do you do that, is through simulation work, and really making sure your simulation work has those outcomes that you implement by getting that documentation, decision-making processes in place. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a quick idea about some of the things that we've experienced in the Varroa response and some of the things that you might be able to do in your industry. But it's really hard and it's really boring to do stuff about biosecurity, particularly in peacetime. But our experiences from this, and I know there's multiple people in this room who were affected party representatives who would also agree that being prepared and doing stuff before the response is so critically important to being prepared and actually making it work properly. And I didn't talk about it in there, and I'm looking at Peter Cornish, because categorisation of the pest as well is something that you need to do prior to a response. So we know in the plant sphere there is a lot of uncategorised pests, including in the berry industry. We need to get on that as well. That's it from me. Thank you.